Okay.
We've spent some time talking about when a person can interrupt in the middle of the Shema and in the middle of the blessings of the Shema. And we then quoted a brisa, and the brisa clarified something that we were a little unclear of in the Mishnah, and we answered the Mishnah, and then we brought a brisa to show that what we answered for the Mishnah was a correct way of explaining the Mishnah, because we see in the brisa it spells it out. And what's interesting in the brisa is that if you look into the brisa, you will find that it hints to certain questions that we were dealing with. For example, I'm going to read for you the brisa now, and I will point out to you what we can see from the brisa. Tanya nami hachi, we're 2 lines down from the second line from the top of the page. Tanya nami hachi, we also have a brisa. We also learned this in a brisa as well. Hakoireyas Shema, if a person recites the Shema, Paga by Rabbi, and his Rebbe meets up with him, a Gadol Himenu, or a greater person than him, a greater scholar than him, meets up with him. So it says, Beprakim, in the middle, in between chapters, Shayel Mepnei HaKavod, Ve'ein Tzarech Loimar Shehu Meshiv. He can greet someone that he needs to honor, but we don't even have to say that he can reply to such a person. Of course, you can reply. You can even greet someone that you need to honor. Uva Emtza, and in the middle of a chapter, you're in the middle of a chapter, Shayel Mepnei Hayira, you could greet someone that you need to fear, Ve'ein Tzarech Loimar Shehu Meshiv, and we don't even have to say that you can reply to such a person. Divrei Reb Meir, these are the words of Reb Meir. So let's think for a moment.
That's what I stopped.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about interrupting, and we're mentioning 2 examples. What are the examples that we mentioned for interruptions? One is a person's Rebbe, a person's teacher, and the other example is someone who's a greater scholar than him. These are the 2 examples. And what does the brisa say? That if it's mipnei hakavod, if it's someone you need to honor, then this is the law. If it's for someone you have to fear, this is the law. So let's use the 2 examples and apply them. A person who's your teacher, that would make sense. That's someone you fear. A person who's a greater scholar than you, but he's not your teacher, that would make sense. That's a person you want to give honor to. You don't have to fear him. He's not your teacher, but you give honor to him. So if you see this brisa and you see that it gives these 2 examples, and then it says that the law over here depends on if you fear the person, or there the law depends if you have to honor the person, it would make sense to say that these are the 2 examples that it gives. And so this would mean that who is a person that you need to fear, it means your Rebbe. Who is a person you need to honor, it means someone who's a greater scholar than you. Now, explaining it this way, this is the way one of the commentaries, the Rashba, explains it, and he brings a proof that this is the meaning of someone you need to fear. Now, we said a different opinion earlier on as to who is a person you need to fear. It's a king. We said Rashi says someone who could kill you if you do the wrong thing. So we explained earlier, Rashi's opinion is that someone you need to fear is referring to a king meets up with you, you passes by, you got to interrupt for a king. And the Rashba brings a proof from this brisa that you see that it's not only that it's not, we're not talking about a king. And in fact, the king would be very surprising that the brisa would have to tell you that you could interrupt for a king. It would be obvious. If it's a question of life and death, then there's no question that you have to interrupt. So he says, you see from this brisa that it's referring to someone you need to fear. So that's his proof. Obviously, Rashi has another way of understanding it, but it's what we see from here is we see how the Rishonim, how the earlier commentaries, how they have to learn the entire discussion of the Talmud, and then they see things behind the lines, so to speak, or in between the lines, and they see hints. And that's what helps them understand the Gemara the way they understand it. And that's why earlier on we had this question as to what does it mean someone you need to fear? Yes, Ezra.
I would have a problem to say that I should fear my Rav. I mean, you know, if he's my Rebbe, I would be hoping that he would be teaching me out of ahava, not out of yira.
Uh-huh.
That's my problem with that. That's the reason why when I you know, I understand what Rashi is saying, you know, for a general or a high official or somebody, that is out of yira because they can actually harm you. Your Rav is not going to harm you. At least I hope not.
Right, but you're translating Rashi's translation of harm and fear. You have to move once you're explaining it like the Rashba, you have to go with his understanding of what it means fear. And it's not a fear of harm. It's a mitzvah of someone who you're supposed to fear, like a parent and a Rebbe, who's a mitzvah to fear. Now, you're not afraid of their harming you. You're fulfilling the mitzvah of ish imay va'aviv tiro. By a parent, you're fearing you're fearing your parent. By a Rebbe, it's yiras shamayim meira rabach k'meira rabbi. It says meira rabach k'meira shamayim. You should fear your Rebbe like you fear heaven.
Okay.
So you have to translate. In other words, you can't stick in the translation of the Rashi and then try to understand the Rashba. But we got to go into the Rashba's meaning of it. So this is the meaning. It's a different meaning of what fear is. But you're right. You got to we have to shift our understanding. So according to that, it actually makes could be a difference in the laws of interruptions. What do I mean? Well, we mentioned that during the blessings of the Shema, there is a question if you should interrupt if it starts thundering and lightning. Do you interrupt to say the bracha on thunder and lightning? And we also mentioned that there's interruptions such as if you're holding not with the congregation, and the congregation is up to Kedusha or Kaddish or Moedim, are you supposed to reply with them? So the question is, when you reply to these statements that are being recited by the congregation, is this considered because of honor for Hashem, or is it considered because of fear for Hashem? If you're afraid that he's going to hurt you, Hashem is not going to hurt you. If you're afraid that it's if you have an obligation to honor it, or if it's fear because there's a mitzvah to fear Hashem, yes, there's a mitzvah of yiras Hashem. So it depends on how you translate this Gemara, how you translate what the yira is, mipnei hayira, that you interrupt for fear. Is it because of fear that someone's going to kill you? Or is it because of fear where you have an obligation to show fear for someone who deserves your fear? And so again, that would come down to a difference in halacha. For example, if you're in the middle of a paragraph, you're not supposed to interrupt for honor, but you are allowed to interrupt for fear. So would you interrupt in the middle of a paragraph for, would you well, it depends actually. Replying, I have to take that back. There's a difference between greeting and replying. So greeting would be reciting a bracha on the thunder and lightning, probably. That would be like greeting. And replying would be answering to Kedusha and Baruchu and Maidim. So here you would have a difference between, when you're allowed to greet if you're in the middle of a paragraph. Because if you consider thunder and lightning greeting Hashem out of fear, you could do it. If you consider thunder and lightning, the bracha on thunder and lightning greeting Hashem out of honor in the middle of a paragraph, you would not be allowed to do it, possibly, if according to this way of looking at it. So it depends on how you translate fear, and that would create a difference in halacha, possibly. Yes, Robert.
I think for English, there may be an issue of translating from the Hebrew fear, and that English doesn't have the appropriate word to essentially wrap everything around it, because fear is also reverence, respect, awe, and so we may be limited in that translation because you're in awe of God, and so you're little, there's a sense of vulnerability, let's say. So what is vulnerability? Fear. Same thing of high respect, reverence. So that's the quality of the translation we may not be adequate having in English.
Thank you, Robert.
Well said. Well said. That's a good point.
Yeah, that's very well said.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Okay, so we're going to now go back into the Gemara. I see someone's hand is up. I don't know if that's from before.
I was going to say that I don't fear Hashem. That's all I was going to say.
Yet, you have to add the word yet. We
I don't
have
know
a
what
There
it's
will come a day.
Yeah,
we
it
have
can
a
all be
mitzvah to love Hashem and to fear Hashem.
right. It can be all contextual relative to the action that's going to happen.
And there are different levels of fearing Hashem. There's fearing reverence, as Robert mentioned, and awe, and there's also fear of punishment.
I
You
do
do
have
something
one
wrong.
question. I do have one question.
Yes,
What is Yetzirah? Yetzirah.
Yetzer
Or
Hara
who
is
is Yetzirah? Or what is Yetzirah?
Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination that always wants you to do the wrong thing.
It's
That's
only an
Yetzer Hara.
inclination.
It's when the doctor tells you no more 7-layer cake, and you grab a piece of 7-layer cake and start eating it. That is your Yetzer Hara.
Okay. All right.
And
Thank
the
you.
same applies to all sins. That's one sin, is going against your health, doing things that are unhealthy. But other sins like not keeping Shabbos and not eating kosher,
Yeah.
eating non-kosher, and
Our concept of sin
so
is totally different from the Goyim. Totally different, correct?
Okay. So the Gemara that we're up to, actually, let me finish this brisa. I didn't conclude. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Be'emtza shoyel b'pnei hayira. In the middle of a paragraph, a person would be allowed to greet someone who they have to fear. Umeishev b'pnei hakavod, and you can reply to a greeting to someone that you need, or that you're obligated to honor. Uveprakim, and in between paragraphs. Shoyel b'bnei hakavod, you can greet someone who deserves your honor. Umeshiv shalom l'chol adam, and you can reply to a greeting to any person that greets you. And that is because you're in between paragraphs. So that's the laws of the blessings of the Shema and the Shema itself. Now the Gemara asks, Ba mine achi, Tana dve Reb Chia. Achi was the Tana, or Echi probably, Echi, was a person who taught brises in the base medrash in the academy of Reb Chia, and he asked from Reb Chia a question. Now, just a little trivia. Who do we know's name was Echi from the Torah? One of Binyamin's sons. One of Benjamin's sons was Echi, Varosh, Mupim, Chupim. He had very interesting names. So one of them's name was Echi. So this Tana, his name, this scholar in the base medrash of Reb Chia, his name was Echi. I'm not advising someone should name their child this, but it is a name from the Torah. So Echi was a Tana that taught brises in the base medrash of Reb Chia. He was a scholar, I should say, that taught brises in the base medrash of Reb Chia, and he asked Reb Chia, "Bahalel uva Megillah mahu sheyafsik." What is the law about interrupting in the middle of Hallel and in the middle of the Megillah? Is a person allowed to interrupt in the middle for these type of things? For example, someone who you need to honor, would you be allowed to interrupt? While they're banging at Haman, someone comes in, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to interrupt, you'll miss a word. But maybe while they're banging at Haman, or or the Balkaire is folding the Megillah, he's in the middle of folding it, so you have a moment there, and someone that you need to honor, you need to fear, walks in. So what is the din? Would you be allowed to interrupt such a prayer? The same thing would apply to Hallel. You're in the middle of reciting Hallel. Would you be allowed to interrupt?
No, I don't think so.
He says yes.
So the Gemara says, Mi amrinan, there's a word missing here. The Bach adds in a word, mi. Mi amrinan kal v'chomer. Do we say a kal v'chomer? Kal v'chomer means well, there's a Latin word, I think, fortiori or something. But,
Right.
Is that how it's pronounced?
That's what it says, yes, and Steinholtz says that.
I don't know if anyone ever uses that word. I don't know if people.
After the fact.
What?
After the fact. A fortiori.
But the a kal v'chomer means if a person who's skinny would weigh down the boat, wouldn't be so for sure a person who's fat would not be able to go on this boat because it'll weigh it down. It's a method of using of figuring something out based on the fact that something even easier can't be done. For sure, something harder can't be done. So we have a kal v'chomer here with Shema. If Shema, you would not be allowed to interrupt. For sure, Hallel.
Right.
I'm sorry, I said it wrong. If Shema, there are instances where you are allowed to interrupt. For sure, in these cases, there are instances where you could interrupt for those instances. If you could interrupt for the instances in Shema, which is biblical, for sure you could interrupt for Hallel and Megillah.
Rabbinic.
So that is the Gemara's thought. That's one side of the thought. What's the other side? Why would you not be allowed to interrupt? Why would Hallel and Megillah be more strict than Shema? So yes, Yehuda.
Well, just like with the Shemona Esrei, which is rabbinic, you can't interrupt, but the Shema, which is biblical, you can.
That's a good point. That's a good point. We do find other cases where you can't interrupt, even though it's rabbinic. That's a very good question, and I have to think about that. So that's a challenging question. That's a good point. The Gemara doesn't mention that. The Gemara gives a different thought. That's why I'm saying it's a good question. It turns out it's a question instead of a. It's not the answer of the Gemara. It's not the way the Gemara is understanding it. Why would Shemona Esrei be incomparable to Hallel and Megillah? Maybe they should be considered similar. Well, maybe the answer to that question is that the Shemona Esrei are blessings upon blessings. And wherever you interrupt, you're interrupting it's considered like one long blessing. The Hallel and the Megillah, although you made a blessing on reading it, but you already read some of it. So it's not considered that you're interrupting a blessing, possibly. In other words, here you're interrupting a blessing, the Shemona Esrei. We consider it like one long blessing. Hallel and Megillah, although you recite a blessing before it, which is true, you did recite a blessing to do it, but once you say a paragraph, well, I'm not sure. You do say a blessing at the end of Hallel and Megillah as well. So maybe we should call it all one blessing. But I don't see it that way. I'll tell you why. Because the blessings of Shemona Esrei are continuous blessings. The whole middle is all blessings. The Hallel and the Megillah is the entire middle is not a blessing. It's the mitzvah of recital of whatever you're doing. So you're just fulfilling the mitzvah of recital, and just like Shema, it's a mitzvah of recital. This also is a mitzvah of recital. It's not like you're exactly breaking the in the middle of the blessing, making an interruption. Anyway, it's just a thought. I don't have a good answer for you, Yehuda. I'm just throwing a thought out, but it deserves a little more thinking about and maybe seeing if any of the commentaries talk about it. But anyway, let's see what the Gemara says now. So the Gemara has, on the one hand, maybe you could interrupt because Kavachaimer, Kriya Shema d'Oraisa Paisek. If Kriya Shema, which is biblical, you can interrupt. Hallel d'Rabbanan miboy. Hallel, that's only rabbinic. Is that a question? Of course you should be allowed to interrupt. Oidilma, or maybe Persume Nisa Adif. Maybe publicizing the miracle is more important than Shema, than a biblical obligation. Here you're publicizing the miracle. And publicizing the miracle is possibly more important than the Shema. And therefore, maybe you would not be allowed to interrupt. And that's a very interesting idea that Persume Nisa carries such a, at least in the thought process of the Gemara, it is extremely crucial. We know that Persume Nisa, there is a mitzvah to like go to a place where they're reading the Megillah. The more people, Persume Nisa, you're revealing the miracle, you're making the miracle more public, more honored, more publicized. Yes, Ben.
Maybe on the Shema, you have a couple places a couple possibilities why you can stop. On the Megillah, you don't have possibilities. They tell you you have to hear every word. And you know, if you are interrupted, you don't hear every word.
Right. So I answered that question. I said, maybe when they are saying the Haman, you give a big Shalom Aleichem to your Rebbe who just walked in. When they're in the middle of banging at the Haman. So you you have an extra, 15 seconds over there. And then when the Baal Koirei has to fold the Megillah, it's supposed to be folded. So sometimes he takes a moment in the middle of the Megillah, takes a little break to fold it, to refold it. So sometimes you get a moment break. So that's my understanding of how a person would interrupt in the middle of a Megillah. I should also mention that there is an idea, it's good to know. I should mention it because we're about to hear the Megillah in a few days. That what happens if you do miss a word in Shul from the Megillah? So what you're really supposed to do is use your Chumash and read the word you missed, and read the next few words and catch up to where the Chazan is, because you need to hear the Megillah in order. And even if you miss a few words from the Baal Koirei, who's reading from a kosher Megillah, you are allowed to read up to half of the Megillah from a non-kosher Megillah. So you would be allowed to use your Chumash to read, to catch up to where the Baal Koirei, where the reader is up to, and catch up to where he is. So you'll be reading it in order. And even though you heard a few words from yourself and you missed the Baal Koirei, you didn't hear him, it's okay. It's still kosher and it's fine. You don't have to hear it again. But if you miss a word, otherwise you would need to go and hear it again. So it's good to know that. And that also is an option where your friend, your Rebbe walks into shul, you give him a big Shalom Aleichem, and then you go right back to your Megillah and you start reading your Chumash, catch up to the Baal Koirei, and you're fine. Now, this doesn't work in the beginning and in the end. I just want to mention it only works in the middle of the Megillah. And it's questionable if it works in the beginning or end of a chapter. So you have to do, this missing a word doesn't work in the beginning of the Megillah or like the first verse or the end verse of the Megillah, but it works in the middle if you miss a word. If you miss the first word, forget it. You're lost. The only thing you could do then is maybe run to the person with a kosher, has a kosher Megillah, and read from the kosher Megillah the first verse, and then run back to your seat and catch up to the Chazan. But you got to read the first verse from a kosher Megillah. Yes, Ezra.
The question I have is, why did they pick Megillah and Hallel? And I mean, for the Shema, we already know that you can't say it out of order and you have to say it in a particular order. So I can understand that, why they use Megillah. Is the requirement to say the Pakim of Hallel in order as well? And because if that's the case, that might be the connection between those three.
Well, I'm not sure about the problem of, the paragraphs in Shema is not a problem, mixing up the paragraphs. The problem was mixing up verses, a pasuk, changing the order. I'm not aware of Hallel if you mess up the order of the verses, if that's a problem. But my thought to answer your question would be that the Gemara gave these two examples because these are two examples of Persume Nisa, publicizing the miracle. And these would be two examples where on the one hand they're rabbinic, but on the other hand you have the publicity, you have publicizing the Persume Nisa part of it, and therefore it would be a comparison. The other point that I would make is it's similar to Shema, because Shema you have a bracha before and a bracha after. In both of these you have you're doing a mitzvah of recital, and you have a blessing before it and a blessing after it. So these are the examples where you have that. So maybe so along those lines, that's my understanding of why the Gemara picked these two examples. But then again, I didn't really think about maybe other examples. I don't know if you want to come up with. I have to think of what other cases could we ask? You know, we gotta use our heads to ask such a question. Like, where else do you have similar things where it would be a problem to interrupt?
Why?
Benching, maybe. What would you think? What?
The question I have, you said Pisumenisa is halal.
Yes, which is interesting. We don't always think of it that way.
No, that's I can understand the Megillah and I can understand the Kriyat Shema, but halal, for whatever reason, just doesn't fit the mold, so to speak.
Well, the reason we recite Hallel is to thank Hashem for the miracles of each of the Yom Tovim and praising Hashem. And so it's all it obviously is an element of Persumei Nisa, which again, you're right. We don't always think about it that way. You know, that when during Hanukkah we were discussing in our classes about the reason for the miracle of Hanukkah, because there's different ways of looking at Hanukkah. It could be the miracle of the oil, the miracle of the war, and the rededication of the Beis Hamikdash. And so one of the practical applications that came to mind, was mentioned, was while you are reciting Hallel, maybe you should have in mind which miracle we are celebrating for. In other words, why are we reciting the Hallel? For which miracle are we reciting the Hallel? Now, obviously, you would have in mind all of them, but which one would be the main one that you're thinking of when you're saying the Hallel as the main miracle? Like maybe it should even be meant, it should even be thought of. I'm mentioning that because, you know, we don't always think about these things, and especially our prayers often are just, lip service. But, when you start thinking about it and trying to concentrate, the Hallel is a tremendous time of thanks to praises of Hashem, and an obligation to praise Hashem. Yes, Robert.
I want to go back to the subject of Purim. I would like to know if it's realistic, or if we as a class or individuals, because of our studying with you, does Chabad have a broadcast Purim service with the reading of the Megillah that we could then log on to be a part of?
So the problem with hearing a Megillah on Zoom is that you're really not fulfilling the mitzvah.
But then we're stuck at home, and so what is the alternative? Just doing it at home, or so that, to me, I'm not informed as to what the remedy is.
It's a good question. It's a very good question. What can people do? I was actually hoping that the rabbis would come up with a solution of writing a Megillah in English on parchment. I was hoping that for COVID, that they would come up, the big rabbis, would come up with a way to do this, and they didn't. But I was thinking, because, Megillah could be, as we were learning about different things, could be done in other languages, that maybe Megillah could be written in other languages and be fulfilled, allow people to fulfill the mitzvah properly. But the fact is, the rabbis did not convene and get a consensus to do that. And so the Zoom or the computer option, it's similar to listening to a microphone. If you hear someone over a microphone, you can answer Amen to Kaddish, because you're replying to Kaddish and Kedusha, which is okay. But to fulfill a mitzvah that you're supposed to recite, you have to hear that person's voice, not just the sound that's coming through a microphone. You have to actually hear their vocal sound.
Right, in person. Essentially, there's no substitute for being in person.
Yeah, or even if you don't see him, but
Yeah.
but he could be, could be outside the window, but but you're
Understand.
hearing it, that you're hearing his voice. But if you hear it through a microphone, it is not fulfilling the mitzvah. Now, what are the other options? So one option is that if you own or you could borrow a kosher Megillah, then even if you don't do the song, the tune properly, it's called the trup. But as long as you read the words properly with the right vowels, you fulfill the mitzvah. So if you have someone with you who could correct you on the words, and it will take you a little longer unless you prepare in advance. But there are numerous sites that you could actually listen to and prepare in advance, or you could just read it yourself a few times in a regular, and then you read it in the kosher Megillah. And you'd be surprised how many people have kosher Megillahs. They could lend it to you, and you could read it yourself in your, so that is an option, reading the Megillah. The other option is, if depending on how nervous people are, to have outside Megillah readings, with social distancing. So you have the option of having an outside. Now, if you're alone and you don't have anyone that could correct you or help you, you could also listen online to a Megillah reading that was done, that was done with someone who knows what he's doing. And there are numerous ones online. And while you're listening to it, you say the right words. So you might not have someone standing there, but you have the computer correcting you, you're listening to the computer, and I would put it on slow. They have different modes. You can put these playbacks on. So when you listen to a class that the speaker speaks very slow, you put it on double fast. When you listen to the Megillah, and you want to make sure not to make a mistake, put it on double slow. In this way, you'll actually you'll actually fulfill the mitzvah properly. The other option is to call the local Chabad house and see if they have anyone coming nearby. I'm sure you're in Point East, Robert, right? I'm
Right,
sure
yes.
there are some. I know a few people that live there, so
Okay.
I'm sure they're going to be listening to a Megillah reading. I don't know if they're going to be
Okay.
comfortable traveling to a shul, or going to a shul, or they'll go to something outside. But there definitely, there are definitely some other Yidden over there that are going
Good
to
to
want to
know.
hear the Megillah.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question,
Yeah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I have a siddur that says anointed edition. Does that mean it's kosher?
I'm so sorry. I didn't hear clearly what you said.
Okay, I have a siddur that says anointed
You were falling asleep.
edition, anointed. Does that mean it's kosher?
I didn't really hear the first half of your sentence.
She said anointed
Anointed.
edition.
Right.
Anointed edition
Edition, right.
Yes.
of a
Yeah.
siddur, annotated maybe.
No,
Anointed siddur.
anointed.
No, has to be annotated.
It must be a mistake.
On the front, it says anointed edition.
Okay. How does it spell anointed?
ANNOTATED.
That's annotated.
Okay, it's annotated. It's not anointed. Okay,
Right.
my mistake.
Rabbi.
I'm sorry.
Rabbi.
Okay. Yes,
It's Moshe.
Moshe.
What I wanted to ask you is,
It is?
what about during slichot services when they're blowing the shofar? The Sfaradim, they do it for before the Chagim. What about that? Are they allowed to see this on Zoom? I mean, is that also a prohibition, or it's not allowed? I mean,
Well, again, slichot. You're blowing the shofar. It's not exactly the mitzvah of shofar that you're fulfilling. There's no obligation.
I know, but they do blow the shofar, during that period of time.
Right, during the month of Elul, everyone blow. I don't know. I mean, we don't do it during slichot. We do it, at the end of the davening.
At the end yes, right. That's what.
Is that how the Sephardic people actually blow it during the slichot part, or do they blow it later? At
Yes,
the end?
they do. I, as far as I know, they do. Yeah.
During the slichot. Interesting. Anyway, however you do it, it's a custom. It's not an obligation. You're not, it's not a problem. To many people who don't go to shul don't even hear it. So it's you're not doing anything wrong by hearing it on the internet, hearing it on the Zoom. But
Yeah.
the problem is when you have to fulfill a mitzvah, and in order to fulfill a mitzvah, you have to hear on Rosh Hashanah. You need to hear the shofar. If you, in fact, even if it's an echo shofar, it's not kosher. You need to actually hear the shofar. So that's a microphone is a lot worse than an echo, and a lot. So that's the problem. You need to hear it actually from a person and the person's voice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to continue, and we were
Yeah, but you shouldn't.
going over the question of the Gemara. I'm
I
sorry.
want to,
Another question? Okay. The Gemara said, so what is the halacha here? Is persume nisa better? And therefore you would not be allowed to interrupt? Or is the fact that Shema you could interrupt for sure, Hallel and Megillah you could interrupt? So Amar Lei, so Rebbe Chia told Eichi, he said, Poisek, you can interrupt, Ve'ein bekach klum, and there is no problem. So you're allowed to interrupt, and it's not an issue. And Persume Nisa does not override the issue of interrupting, and therefore you would be allowed to interrupt. Now the question is, which Hallels are we talking about? There are two recital of Hallels that we have. We have a recital of the full Hallel, and we have the recital of the half Hallel. The full Hallel is said on Hanukkah, Sukkot, Shavuos, and the first days of Pesach. The half Hallel is recited on the last days of Pesach, the middle days and last days of Pesach, and Rosh Chodesh, and I think that's it. What else?
Depends
What?
on your minhag, because no. besides that.
What do you mean? Does Spartak have a different custom?
No, yeah, Yom Ha'atzmaut people don't.
Oh, Well, the Gemara is not going to talk about that. That's for sure. But the days of the full Hallel, that's one situation where we could discuss if you interrupt or not. The days of half Hallel would be another discussion of if you interrupt or not. Now, what's interesting is on the days that we recite half Hallel, we recite a bracha on the Hallel, like Rosh Chodesh. But there is a discussion, and it's based on this Gemara, about if you are supposed to recite a bracha on those days, that half Hallel is recited. And
Sephardim don't.
And right, the Sephardim do not say the bracha. It's only a minhag to recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. But we recite a bracha, and it's based on this Gemara over here. So we're going to now see what the Gemara says about the difference between these two Hallels. Is there a difference or not with regard to interruptions? Amar Rabbah. Rabbah said, Yomim shehayachid goimer bahem es hallel, the days that a individual completes the Hallel, Rashi brings down, it's an obligation to say the whole Hallel on 21 days. And what he means 21 days is he's talking about outside of Israel. Because in Israel, you don't have 21 days, you have 18 days, because you miss the extra day of Yontiv. Which is on Sukkot, you have an extra day of Yontiv, Pesach, and Shavuos. So we have an extra day, or 3 extra days. So we have 21 days where we complete the whole Hallel. Now, Rabbah says days that we complete the Hallel, bein perek leperek posek, between each chapter, you can interrupt. Be'emtza haperek, but in the middle of the chapter, einay posek, you can't interrupt. V'yamim she'einay yochid goymer behenes ha'halel, in days that an individual, that we don't complete the Hallel, afilu be'emtza perek posek, even in the middle of a paragraph, you would be allowed to interrupt. And what this means is that the laws of Shema would apply similarly to the days that we complete the Hallel. And there, the days that we complete the Hallel, you would have laws of if it's in between in between two chapters or in the middle of a chapter, and interrupting for someone that you need to honor is not always allowed. And here, and Rabbah says, it depends. Between chapters, you'd be allowed to interrupt to greet someone you need to honor. And in the middle of a chapter, einay posek, you wouldn't be allowed to. But when it comes to days that you only say half Hallel, so there, even in the middle of a paragraph, you would be allowed to greet someone, meaning it's much more lenient during those times because it's only a minhag, that Hallel, and therefore it's more lenient. It doesn't have the same rules as the regular Hallel, which would have the rules of Shema. So the Gemara asks a contradiction because we have a story of a rabbi that went to went by another big rabbi, and what happened was he didn't interrupt. And because he didn't interrupt, it implies like maybe you're not allowed to. And so this is the Gemara says here, what is the story? Eini, is this true? Is this true that if you do not say the whole Hallel, if it's like a Rosh Chodesh, and you only say half Hallel, you're allowed to interrupt? Rav bar Shava, Rav bar Shaba, Ikla Lagabe de Ravina. Rav bar Shaba traveled traveled to Ravina. He passed by Ravina. It doesn't say what day it was, but it was probably a Rosh Chodesh, the day that you don't finish the Hallel. In other words, you only say half Hallel, or maybe it was the end of Pesach. And he didn't interrupt to greet him, which means that Ravina did not greet Rav bar Shaba. So Ravina did not interrupt to greet this other rabbi. And so it sounds like, why didn't he interrupt to greet him? Because he was in the middle of a chapter. In the middle of a chapter, you're not supposed to greet someone who you want to honor. And therefore, he didn't interrupt. So the Gemara says, no, that's not why. Shani Rav bar Shaba delei choshev alei de Ravina. Rav bar Shaba was not demanding that so significant, I should say. He wasn't so significant in the eyes of Ravina, meaning he was a scholar, but obviously Ravina was a much bigger scholar. So when you're a bigger scholar, it's not, you don't feel an obligation to show respect to the smaller scholar, and therefore he wasn't going to interrupt. He didn't interrupt in the middle of a paragraph. And what this really shows us is that even on days that you only say half Hallel, it doesn't mean you're allowed to interrupt for anything. You got a phone call, go run outside a shul and go speak to or you got to make a phone call to someone. It means that if it's a case of an obligation of honor, respect, and someone will be insulted or someone deserves your honor, those are examples where a person would be theoretically allowed to interrupt. Again, nowadays, we've mentioned a few times that nowadays these laws don't exactly apply in most scenarios, but nevertheless, the idea of interrupting in the middle of a half Hallel is obviously more lenient than interrupting in the middle of a complete Hallel, and that we see from this Gemara. Now,
Rabbi?
Yeah.
The fact that when they quote Rabbah, it talks about, says Yachid. Are we talking about only by yourself or in shul also?
So Taisvis deals with this. It's a very long Taisvis over here. And he mentions in the beginning, he says, it doesn't really mean a Yachid. It uses this term because when they would shech the Korban Pesach, they would do it in say Hallel, they would do it in a public, or when we talk about Yom Tov, everyone's celebrating Yom Tov. So it uses the term Yachid, that the Yachid is not Gomer Behenes Hallel. There is one opinion that says there's a difference between a minyan, if you're reciting it with a minyan, or if you're saying Hallel yourself. And if you say it with a minyan, then you say a bracha. And if you say it without a minyan, then you wouldn't. So there is such an opinion, but the fact that it uses the term Yachid is a little surprising. You're right. It's discussed. They discuss the wording.
But it's not necessarily specific, just individual. This
Right.
would apply with a minyan also. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Applies to me. Okay, so let's see. We have a few minutes. Let's do the next little piece of Gemara then. Ba minei Ashian. Ashian asked. Ashian was Tana Dvei Reb Ami. He was a person who taught Braisas in the base medrash of Reb Ami. He asked a question, May Reb Ami, from Reb Ami. Hasharui b'tainis, if a person is, he is in the middle of fasting, and he wants to taste something. Mahu sheyitoim achila ushasiya. What is the din if he is allowed to taste food or drink? He wants to know if it needs salt, if it needs spices. He's cooking and he wants to taste the food. And he's in the middle of a fast. Is he allowed to taste it? The same question applies. You would need to make a bracha, which we'll soon see, about tasting. When you taste food, do you recite a bracha for tasting it? Again, your interest is not to eat it and to enjoy the food. Your interest, your purpose is simply to taste the food and to see if it needs anything. So the question is, what is the din? Are you allowed to eat or drink in the time of? And the question also applies would be washing out your mouth on a fast day. Washing out your mouth, you're putting water in your mouth, but your purpose is not to drink it. Your purpose is to wash out your mouth. But there might be a few little drops that might stay and might be swallowed. So would that be considered? So the Gemara says, Mahu sheyitim achila Mahu sheyitim. I read it wrong. Hashari b'tainis ma'u sheyitim. If a person is in the middle of fasting, what is the din if he's allowed to taste? Achila ushasiya kabilale. He accepted on himself not to eat or drink. And if he's only tasting, halekha, he's not eating or drinking. He's only tasting it. Now, Tosfos mentions that we're talking about that he's going to spit it out. And he's just tasting. And shouldn't be a problem. He said he's not going to eat or drink. That's not called eating or drinking. It's not called eating or drinking if you taste it and spit it out. Dilma, or maybe maybe he accepted on himself not to have pleasure from food or drink, and he's getting pleasure from the taste. So the Gemara answers, Amar le toyem ve'ein bekach klum. You can taste and it's not a problem. And then the Gemara says, Tanya nami hachi, we also have a brisa like this. Mat emes eina tu'una bracha, a person who tastes does not require a blessing. V'ashori b'tainis toyem ve'ein bekach klum, a person who is in the middle of fasting does not have a problem tasting something. It's not a problem. Akama, how much, up to how much can a person taste? Rabami v'Ravasi taime ad shir reviaso. They tasted up until the amount of a revius, which is the amount of maybe about 3 ounces or 4 ounces. Different opinions of the shear of a revius halug, a quarter of a lug. Rashi says that's the revius halug. It's a lug was a certain measurement in those days, obviously somewhere around 12 to 16 ounces. That was what a lug was, some type of a jar, and a quarter of it is the amount that we normally make kiddush on a revius, and at least for our Brochos for Pesach and so on. So that's the amount that they would taste until that up to that amount. So that's this Gemara about tasting on a fast day or making a bracha, reciting a bracha on tasting. That it's not an issue. Okay, everyone.
One question before.
Rabbi,